Good evening. This is the most on time we've ever done here. We were always running late, so I'm so glad that we have this opportunity tonight to host this talk. I am particularly looking forward to the talk, having seen the exhibition in Singapore at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Art a few weeks. Well, it's been a couple of months ago since I saw it, and I have to say, for those of you who have not, I think some of you have seen the exhibition of Yong Mun Sen in Nanyang when it was first here in Hong Kong, February of 2021. Remember 2 years ago when we were still in the height of COVID. And that was such a breath of fresh air when we had the opportunity to see the exhibition at the Malaysian consulate. But this is even a better show in that it has a lot more art, and also the space is fantastic. So I am so glad I had a chance to see it. And I'm really delighted that Bridget, Dr. Bridget Tennant, is coming all the way from Singapore to give us this talk. She is director of the art galleries and the Institute of Southeast Asian Art at the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. So we're really, really delighted Bridget is here with us. And also, I want to thank Dr. Jiao Tianlong from the Hong Kong Palace Museum, head curator, who I believe was the opening of the show in Singapore for the Yong Mun Sen when the show opened a few months ago. And so we're really delighted Dr. Jiao is here to kind of help moderate the Q&A. And I want to thank Michael and Sneeza for suggesting this, and also for the book. I mean, one of the reasons we're here for the talk is because the catalog for the exhibition is available in the back, and we're really delighted that the launch in Hong Kong is here at Asia Society. Michael and Sneeza have been longtime friend of Asia Society Hong Kong, and also PC members, and also fellow alumni from our uh, UST days. And that's why we're really pleased to have former Professor Wei Shi, former president of Hong Kong UST, here with us to help kind of give opening speech in a few minutes. But again, I want to thank all of you for being here. And this exhibition was very special in that this year, I did not know this until I was in Singapore. This year marks really the 85th anniversary of Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, and Michael Yong Mun Sen had a role in the founding of it. So it's a very fitting that this exhibition opened in Singapore when it did, and the space. I have to say, I have to really commend Bridget, that it's really a wonderful space to see the breadth of his work. I think it's about 78 pieces of artwork, mostly from the 30s to 1950s. And I think we're going to hear more about it as Bridget kind of give us a presentation about it in a little bit. But again, thank you all for being here on a rainy Friday night. And I have promised it's going to be a great program tonight. And I also want to thank all of you for your support. I feel like this has been, we're coming out of 3 years of this is COVID. And now I think just even last month to see more everybody coming back to Hong Kong for the art fair. It's so great that Hong Kong is back. Actually, I kind of have to admit, I don't think Hong Kong went anywhere. Hong Kong was always there, and to see kind of the energy and return is really wonderful to see. And right now, we currently have a wonderful show in the Chantal Miller Gallery, Fusion 2. So those of you who have not had an opportunity to see it, please visit. And I also, now that we can travel, I also want to encourage you to go to Singapore to see this wonderful exhibition, and we're going to hear more about it tonight. And with that, I'm going to invite Professor Shi to come up and to say a few words. I think those of us who know him as a engineer, a scientist, does not know that he has a heart of an artist and as a photographer. And we're going to hear more about. Hopefully, we're going to get a glimpse of what his passion. I think he shares that in common as a photographer. And those of you who do not know, Yong Mun Sen was also a photographer and an educator as well, like Professor Shi. So, Professor Shi, can I ask you to come up and say a few words?
Thank you, Alice. Sanisa, Michael, and all the friends. I'm here as a friend too. Okay, so I've been watching Sanisa and Michael, and in that order, for doing this over the last, actually, probably 3 years, I would say. And I'd just like to say a few words to share my own observation. We, in this part of the world, many of us feel that we have a very long lineage, historically, dating back to, I don't know, several thousand years, that's what we would like to say. On the other hand, I think it's also very clear that because of war, World War II, 1949, because of the poverty, so many of us, my own case included, have very fragmented memory and family ties. Our ancestors may have gone back so many years ago, but memory and continuity in our family certainly has not been the case for many of us. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Asian countries are just some of the examples. So in that sense, to see Michael and Sanisa as Yong Mun Sen's grandchildren, daughter-in-law, to do this, I think it's really remarkable. It's not unusual to see grandchildren to pay tribute, to really say something, I think, respectfully to the grandparents for whatever they have accomplished. But based on what I knew, they started from nothing because they didn't have a single painting in their possession when they started. And then back in 2021, the smaller scale exhibition. Then later I was at their home a couple times, and I was just seeing this uncontrollable growth of the number of paintings all over the places, but not in any ugly way. It's really quite remarkable. It's really a very small museum in that sense. So I would say any grandparents to have grandchildren like that will have to be very, very proud. I didn't know much about the painter until I got to hear from Michael and Sanisa. Then I got interested and intrigued. I visited the exhibition in the Nanyang house, Consul General Place, twice. And we have experts later on who will guide us through. I just say that myself, I have to say that for somebody who was not trained formally, starting from a place that has no such tradition, to say kind of modestly, to have come to this point, is really nothing short of being remarkable. And just my own particular appreciation of his work, it was he not only combined nature and humanity, but really a lot of what I appreciate more was his blending of human dynamics when trying to make a living, pushing cart, ship, and things like that, in a way that's much more than just a portrait. He did portray, of course, but these are the things which attract me. And so when I first saw that, my own first instinct was, I remember when I was young, very young, in primary school, I read this one of the most authoritative art guide, the Reader's Digest. Okay, I remember I saw a painting by Millet, The Gleaners, 10岁. I always remember that painting. And when I first saw Mun Sen's painting, some of them remind me of that because you see the work, but in such a beautiful way. And as Alice already mentioned, he was not only a painter, he was an educator. So many people follow his footsteps, and now the artwork we have seen in that part of the globe, thanks in no small way to his genius and passion, dedication. And his hard work to try to make a living while to fulfill his passion, dream, of course. We can all appreciate and understand that. And I haven't seen enough of his photos yet, and I hope I will have a chance to see another exhibition by Michael and Sanita about that. Okay, so with that, let's keep looking forward to the next chapter. Thank you.
Okay, it's my great honor now to introduce Dr. Bridget Tracy Tan to the stage. And Dr. Tan graduated with Masters of Art, obtaining first class honors in art history from University of Glasgow in Scotland. And her PhD was obtained from Chelsea College of Art, University of the Arts in London. And then, so we're really delighted that she is here with us to get the presentation started.
We're all gathered here to celebrate Yong Mun Sen, Grandpa.
And some art historians, they would consider him as one of the earliest pioneers of Nanyang artists. But to me, he was actually the grandfather that I never knew.
He's also a founding father for the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. He was recognized as being one of the members of the Pro Tem committee where they were mooting an idea, to found an arts academy based in the region. Eventually, NAFA was born, and you are all here.
Last year was the 60th anniversary of the passing of Yong Mun Sen. And this year is the 85th anniversary of the founding of NAFA. So I could not help a sense of history.
I flipped the page of an exhibition catalog called The Birth of Modern Art in Southeast Asia. Then I found Yong Mun Sen's name in the chapter of the Foundation of the Artist Circle in Malaysia.
Yong Mun Sen and his generation of Nanyang artists, a true embodiment of making art transcending time and space. They live in the time when most artists have to struggle with their training in traditional Chinese art and the powerful impact of Western art. So it is a fusion that have continued to impact the art of China and the artists with Chinese root today. They all belong to the sort of same generation of pioneer artists who are determined to make a difference.
What was so interesting about him was he was actually born here. He was born in the region, although he had a short period studying at home and so on, but he came very young. And he's basically a creature of the Nanyang. Someone was born and internalizing his own life, as it were, to try and see what it meant to actually live in that society. The difference between him and many of the artists like Xu Beihong or Ong Zhanqiu or Zhang Danong or others who came around, many of them coming from China, they actually came as artists. They were already trained and they came out to look for exotic or different, the Nanyang, as it was, a kind of romantic. He was in that picture. It's part of his own quest for self-discovery or to find meaning for his own life, and he can't stop it. It actually comes from inside of him that he wants to really understand and grasp and maybe share with some others.
Many people are surprised that Michael did not inherit any of Grandpa's artworks. Every piece in our collection was bought back from the market. And every piece in our collection is unique and special. It's special for the subject matter, but also about the journey of how it came back into our collection, the provenance, so to speak.
We've really collectively pieced together the life of Yong Mun Sen, my grandfather, as well as his contributions to arts and culture. So we've managed to kind of extend the timeline of our art history, which now we understand pre-war, it was actually a beautiful world. It was actually called the Golden Era.
For a learning institution, this exhibition is also a timely reminder on the innovations in art making, regardless of the medium. Not only was Yong Mun Sen self-taught, but he was under privation and various circumstances, compelled to be resourceful and to innovate.
His paintings has lain very calm and quiet. But the artist who made these paintings was apparently very energetic, full of vitality.
When I look at his paintings and his drawings and so on, I think of it as someone trying to capture his own life. It's not someone describing somebody else's life, just as a picture.
Yong Mun Sen's art have a very distinct visual language, which incorporate both Western or European and Chinese art techniques. It's very hard or almost impossible to classify them into a particular national or stylist category in a way that they are crossing boundaries of ethnicity, style, and time.
So an assembly of 78 artworks, the majority of which are watercolors, actually also includes some photography, hand-painted photography, but also oil works that many hear about legendary in Yong Mun Sen's practice, but have never really had the opportunity to see in person.
We have all these artworks here today, sparking a dialogue, all in the same room. It takes a village to make a retrospective, and we are humbled by the interest that we are here seeing tonight.
Art is about people, and this is very significant at this time in 2023, post-pandemic. Art is about people, and people are essential.
They say that art is the highest form of hope, and we need hope more than ever. In a world full of polarization and conflicts, we need to come together and find a common purpose. And I believe art is a form of soft power.
In the 21st centuries, the story of global diaspora must be an essential part of the narratives of global artistic canon. And for Southeast Asia, Yong Mun Sen and his friends are such a wonderful artists that help define the history of fine arts and making the cultural connection between their ancestral home, that is China, and their home here in the Southeast Asia.
Today it's amazing because it's the exhibition, it's the monograph, and we also launched the yongmunsen.org website this week. Our collection stands ready to be loaned to institutions and museums around the world.
I cannot help being impressed by Mun Sen's strong passion and love for art. And today, we can see this passion and the love for the art continue through Michael and Saniza. Indeed, exhibition making requires serious multitasking skill. Michael and Saniza, you both proved you are very good at multitasking by realizing this exhibition, as well as having the professional eye.
It's not only a celebration of the artist, Yong Mun Sen, who was pioneer in art in Southeast Asia, but it's also a celebration of a family legacy.
I hope students of the academy and the visitors of the show will feel the passion for art that both Mun Sen and you too have poured into this exhibition.
The story are to be retold, rediscovered, and the new insights are to be gained. So today at this exhibition, I'm sure we can all be inspired.
Hello. Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Bridget.
Hi, I'm Tianlong. You already saw both of us on the video. um, Bridget, welcome to Hong Kong.
Thank
It
you.
was good to see her in Singapore, particularly to see the show that curated by Bridget. I think Alice just made an introduction about her. I just want to see more about Bridget. That she's one of the few scholars, authorities on the history of Southeast Asian art. This is a subject that most of us are not so familiar with. I was fortunate when I was in Denver Art Museum. I was in charge of a whole Asia, so I learned a little bit about Southeast Asia and modern contemporary Chinese art. But Bridget really come from a background that she not only did a comprehensive study of the art in Southeast Asia, but also the Chinese art in general. So right now she is the director of the art gallery, we call them, right, in Nafa. But she's also a professor at the Nanyang Academy of Art. Previously, she was the curator of Southeast Asian art and Singapore art in particular in the now you call them a National Gallery, right? It's a Singapore Art Museum before, but it's the National Gallery of Singapore. So today we are really fortunate to have her to come here to talk about this particular exhibition that she worked with Michael and Sneza closely to put together, and also one of the key authors of the catalog, which right on the desk behind you. So without further ado, I will let Bridget to take us through to understand Yong Mun Sen as an artist. Bridget.
Thank you, Dr. Jiao. Okay, I like to manage expectations. So, and after that video, I feel like I don't really need to do this talk. But I have 10 slides here, and the first one, so there's one that's this title slide, so there are actually 9, and there's one that's only words, so there are actually 8 with pictures. Yeah. So anyway, so without further ado, maybe what I could do is just run through the slides. And what I wanted to do is the publication is already here, so maybe have a flip through later. And you saw some highlights of the exhibition, which I think is really quite important. With the slides, what I wanted to do is maybe just, it's going to look a little bit obscure, and maybe just set a kind of a context to kind of understand, if you like, the visual. You heard Dr. Jiao talk about visual language. The visual language, if you like, in Nanyang and specific to Yong Mun Sen's practice. Oop. Sorry, it went too quickly. Okay, so something like this, which you see this piece of photograph here. Sadly, it's not a photograph by Yong Mun Sen. It's a photograph by a pioneer artist, Ip Chung Fan, in Singapore. He's passed on now. But it's a photograph of nets. And you can see the paintings, those 2 paintings on the right-hand side are by Yong Mun Sen. And as I understand it, I think even Michael was talking about when he first saw the painting, he wasn't quite sure whether the nets were being exaggerated. And this is the reality. In those days, specific to that time, the 1940s, 1930s, and 1940s, this was a livelihood. Today, you would identify them as scene nets. They're really huge nets, and they're not environmentally friendly. That's why they're probably not used anymore. But this is what life was about. You know, it was in the industry in itself. People, trying to earn a living. And when you use the nets, what happened was after work, you would have to hang them out to dry, because if they didn't dry, you would have to repair them as well. And you use like organic materials, and it's a process called barking. And if it didn't dry properly, then they would grow bacteria, and they would be destroyed, gradually degrade, and so on. So this is like by way of contextualizing, if you like, the visual world that was part of Yong Mun Sen's everyday life, something that we often take for granted when we look at paintings, that we think, oh, this is in the artist's creativity, his imagination. And in this situation, we would like to say lifelike. So in the title of the slide, like a dream, but actually like life. And so moving on to another a way to contextualize the visual world, two particular deliberately here, the paintings on the left-hand side, two different styles, if you like, and we'll talk a little bit about style later, of what you see in the arrangement, if you like, of the dwellings and also the environmental conditions, and then two archival photographs of the actual area, Tanjung Tokong probably, or Tanjung Bunga in Penang, which was where Yong Mun Sen ended up living. He moved around the streets, and then he lived, and he lived until his death in Penang. So that whole notion of, well, we look at a painting, and then I like to talk a little bit about nostalgia and Orientalism. People look at these things, and then we idealize the history, and then we think about nostalgia as being a yearning, for something that has been lost. But in actual fact, it is really a story for Yong Man Sen, a very visceral, if you like, representation of the environment in which he lived, but also the environment as you would have experienced it. So, in particular, with the watercolor, and there's not enough to show you, and not enough time to talk about it today, but to show you even the quality of the light in the atmosphere that you really encounter when you are in the tropics, in Nanyang specifically. That's a whole different topic altogether, that you will not find anywhere else. And it's worthy to mention also the quality of the light when there are no tall buildings and no metal and no glass. You want to capture it. Okay, so we're here to talk about the book. So with the exhibition, you saw the video, the exhibition, and the publication itself. I deliberately mirrored the publication to the exhibition. So there are 4 sections: the light in Nanyang, people, sights and sounds, and of land and sea. And the reason for doing this, and to put it in this slide also, is to talk a little bit about there are 78 works in the exhibition. Many people knew, and you heard me say it in the video, many people know of Yong Man Sen as being a watercolorist, and there's so many of these watercolors out there that after a while, if you see like 20, you start to think, or 30, you start to think one looks very much like the other, and nothing could be further from the truth. So we put in these categories to kind of give you a framework to look at those works that were the way that we arranged them in the categories. So the light in Nanyang really talks about, as I mentioned earlier, the quality of the light, but also the spiritual aspect of, you heard, the conversations, and in particular with Professor Wang Gongwu, talk about the mind, the person, and the individuals, and how they're affected, and even Professor Weishi, Professor Weishi, talking about, when you suffer, when you have suffering and you're in privation, and then how you come out of that, and connect back, to your history, and so on. So that is covered in the light in Nanyang. And then there's people. I personally, as an art historian, whether it's photography or it's painting, or even a sculpture, people as a subject matter, and portrait as a genre is actually the most difficult subject to really deal with in art, because a very simple analogy would be, a person is a live person, and then when you start to paint them or make a sculpture or take a photograph, many photographers believe this, then it becomes a dead thing. So how do you put the life back into that? So that's people. And then sight sense, and something that Yong Man Sen does very well, actually. And you'll see that in the book if you all come to the exhibition. And then sights and sounds, to put it into perspective, what you see, what you hear, and sometimes we look at, we're very visual people, and with the onslaught of multimedia, the internet, TV, it's an onslaught on your senses. So with sights and sounds in paintings in particular, it's for you to stop for a minute and really reflect on what you're seeing and what you can actually hear. And again, it goes back to the experience that you have, which Yong Man Sen tries to represent in his art. And then the last one, of land and sea, very grandiose type of title, but I really wanted to try and put it back into the narrative about Nanyang migration and the spirit of man, but also because literally land and sea. We're not talking about a cosmopolitan environment with very tall buildings. That is not to say that I don't appreciate, a cosmopolitan environment with air conditioning and tall buildings, but that was his life then. From the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. This is where he was. There were really not a lot of tall buildings, and there was really a lot of people still living by the sea, and the land was, still decorated by trees, and you'll see that in a short while. And people were moving around, and this was their life. Very little that we understand today because we're so used to what we know. And so we put that back in that particular section. Okay, so very quickly to talk about these two portraits, there is a self-portrait of Yong Mun Sen, and then actually a portrait of his second wife. And I do talk about it in the book, but I just want to very quickly mention, you can see his own self-perception, and they were painted around the same time, okay? And then his perception of his, at that time, I think future wife. I don't think they were married, or were they married? Already married. Okay, okay. And so maybe worthwhile to talk about the stylistic sort of influences he may have had, which you will see a little later on. Sorry, the Modigliani in particular. So it's a question we always ask ourselves with a visual history and an artist primarily self-taught. He worked in a bookshop, and he obviously had access to books. And he also was a member of the Society of Chinese Artists, and these artists were all trained also in Western art. And there were obviously a lot of conversations and references to those particular styles of the period. And so this kind of very glaring self-perception, and then this beauty and lightness, and almost, I would even say, cosmopolitan air, about his wife. I would like to, hazard a kind of an interpretation that he looked at in this painting of his wife as a kind of a beacon of hope. And so you can see that. So if I point that out to you, then you start to look at the painting a little differently. So we don't take for granted, when we look at all these paintings, what is it that we're actually seeing? And this is what we want, you to actually think about and look at. So here's another look at people, and in particular, my favorite painting, which is the Beauty Queen, and then the Goose Lady. The Goose Lady is not on exhibition. It's actually, but it's in the book. So I put paintings in this presentation that are published, although they're not on exhibition. And this is important because with the Beauty Queen, it's obviously an Indian national of some sort, and okay, a lot of text, sorry, but just very briefly, even at that time in the 1920s, there were a lot of Indian females in the streets, and they came in really to actually find jobs, and they settled down in the area, and they were mainly from the south, and they outnumbered even the Chinese women in the workforce at that time. We say workforce in a very loose way. They were really workforce laborers, working in the fields, working in the farms. And then to juxtapose that with the Goose Lady, geese, I spent a lot of time reading about geese. It's very interesting. If you're very interested in that, please read about geese, or fowl in general. Is really the simplest kind of husbandry you could have, because the yield is very high. You just need minimal resources, and now we're talking about, the post-pandemic world, sustainability. You need minimal resources to actually run a geese farm, and a woman can actually just take care of it herself, and the yield, potentially becomes really very high. So again, looking at these two works, one is a little bit more poetic than the other, but still a representation, if you like, of what Yong Mun Sen saw around him. So it wasn't something that he was deciding, okay, this is a picturesque subject matter, I'm going to do it. He really was encountering some of these, all of the people who were there, and then just deciding to himself, well, I'm going to, paint a picture of a person, and this person really reflects the environment in which they live and their circumstances. So when I was preparing this live presentation, I was invited to talk a little bit about the Western influences, and in particular the influence of Gauguin and Van Gogh, on Yong Mun Sen. And this is actually very clear. If you were to see enough of Yong Mun Sen's paintings, you will be able to make that association. And it's very important because Gauguin and Van Gogh themselves were humanists to a certain extent. And you would see that in Van Gogh's portrait of Sien de Groot. Sorry, if there are any Dutch people here, sorry for butchering the name. Sorry. If there are any French people here, I'm going to butcher the French later as well. Um, okay, she was a member of a family that Van Gogh spent a lot of time with, and he was observing them, and they're a part of, I don't know if you know the famous painting, The Potato Eaters, that was largely vilified by the artistic community. And so this sort of sense of, I spend a lot of time with you, I get to know you, and then I produce a picture of you. It's not like I paint you, but I get a picture out of you, and this representation, the realism, the visceral feeling of a person there. Even Modigliani, Jeanne Hébutin, is one of his wives, and in fact, she's the last one because after he passed away, she actually committed suicide. And he painted many paintings of her, and you can just by looking at those. What I'm trying to we make that association because the artists were not just imagining a subject matter; they spent a lot of time with the subjects that they were painting in the same way that Yong Mun Sen did as well. And the last two works, Gauguin's work is often compared to the Beauty Queen, and you can see why. And I threw in the Mughal painting because the Asian reference, I think, is really very important as well. The women holding the rose, right? Oh, sorry. The woman holding the rose is very common, or a woman holding a flower is also very common, even in Chinese iconography. And this is a good thing because it's a good thing to remind ourselves because he was obviously someone who was looking at a lot of books and referencing a lot of traditions and not just painting in isolation. And I think this is important when you try to identify an artist's vernacular or his visual style. And there's a lot of stories. If you wanted to Google, Gauguin's Vahin, the young lady, she was actually a lady who lived next door. And he really wanted to paint her in her normal clothes. Normal meaning this was when he was in Tahiti in the Marquesas already, and she turned up in Western clothing, and he was a little bit upset, but obviously he painted it anyway. Okay. And then I threw in another slide where you obviously, I'm a very visual person as an art historian. When I see a work, I automatically think of works that I might have seen before, and the paradigm doesn't escape. So it's impossible to think that Relaxing in 1941 was painted without some kind of visual memory, if you like, of Gauguin's The Child of God. That's what the Tahiti title refers to. And even if you say, well, he probably didn't see the painting, it's really what Gauguin saw in the life of the Tahitians and how that reflects the life of the people, the natives, if you like, the indigenous people that Yong Mun Sen was very familiar with in East Malaysia. That same paradigm, it's a nice coincidence because it just means that people live like that. Even if they never cross-reference that he never saw this painting and then deliberately imitating it, and that's so important from the architecture, from the style, and the way the lady is and is reclining half naked, and so on. Now this last one I think everybody knows, butchering French again, fair warning. D'où venons-nous? Que sommes-nous? Où allons-nous? And I think everybody knows this painting. Where are we going? Where did we come from? Who are we? Something like that. Okay. And why I put this in is because this is a painting that obviously all of the artists would have seen at that period, and in fact, not just the Asian artists, but Chinese artists who were trained in Western art, but also the Western artists. And a very, very large painting of anecdotes and allegories. And this is so important because it just means that, when you look at this entire painting, you're like, okay, it doesn't quite make sense. And that's not important. What was important was it was a narrative. It was deliberate, that all these little pockets, this anecdotal allegories, if you like, of representation, really putting together a story of not just the people in Tahiti, but how the artist saw it. And if you read the history of this painting, Gauguin himself, very quickly, was he was brought up Christian or Catholic, if you like, and there are all these questions of do we, where did man come from? Who are we? What are our morals? What is our spiritual state? And he kind of actually very anti-religious or anti-clerical, if you want to put it that way. But that stuck with him, asking questions about us as humanity. And I think this is something that resonates, even if Yong Mun Sen didn't read about Gauguin, this is something that resonates very clearly with Yong Mun Sen and his paintings, humanity, a representation of the human race, the spirit of man. So this is the last slide, and this painting is not in the exhibition, the Burma Road, but if you go to Penang, this road still exists, and I think it kind of still looks like that. Yeah. So isn't that kind of cool? Everybody now go Singapore, go Penang, book your flights tomorrow. Expedia.com. And this painting by Yong Mun Sen, and then an old photograph of Burma Road, as you can see. And I really wanted to use this to sum it up because, again, we look at a painting, we think, there's some parts of Paris that actually quite look like this, okay? And this is all about, colonial planning and so on. But look at a painting, take for granted what it is that it's representing. But when in actual fact, it's really a mindset, you're living in an environment. And if you look at the photograph in particular, this kind of never-ending road, we're moving, we're constantly moving, and the trees are around us. The trees are gonna be there. The trees are gonna be there as the trees are still there, today in Penang, and they're probably going to outlive us. So this kind of symbolism, which I don't think at that time, if you want to talk about Yong Mun Sen as sort of realizing, okay, this is what he was doing, but years on, decades on, when we look at the painting, that sentience, the sentience, that's the only word that I can think of using, is there. It's apparent. Yong Mun Sen was, you heard Professor Wong Gong Wu talk about it in his interview, was thinking, how do I represent, it's not about what other people, other people's lives, it's about my life, how do I communicate that? And with this particular painting, he has very successfully done that. Well, I would like to think so, and I hope that you agree. Okay, so last slide full of words. Yeah, it's really what I just said. So maybe I'll just read the last paragraph. This lens is not really new. We like to use the word aesthetic, with wild abandon, but aesthetic is really a very specific term that has to do with the experience and not necessarily beauty as such, but an experience that really is transformative. So with this aesthetic journey, the lens is not new, but it really represents a way of perceiving Nanyang and reorienting both our perceptions and our lens and our feelings, and perhaps trying to take something that is hidden inside of all of us, and to bring it out, and give us a healthy sense of self-realization and self-awareness. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chang, for give us in-depth introduction and interpretation of Yong Mun Sen's art. I saw many of his art. Today you show some art that I didn't have a chance to see it yet. I think that will be my plan for the next trip to Singapore, to see more of his art. I think one question I want to have a conversation with you is to try to understand Yong Mun Sen as an artist who was grew up in Nanyang, as a Chinese in a Chinese family or Chinese cultural setting, but he was also educated in China when he was young, and I was wondering, whether you can help us to understand this education background, how that affect his artistic practice later in his life.
Okay, this is a hard question to answer because there is no evidence, if you like, documented evidence. Dr. Zhao and I talked about this, but he was sent when he was born in Sarawak, and then he was sent back to China. 5 years old, he was 5, yeah. and he was sent back to be educated there. And you know, I think all of those of you who have children would know that those are like very formative years. And when I think that's what his father thought was best for him, to go back there. And it was there that we understand he was exposed to you know, calligraphy, poetry, all this classical, if you like, classical Chinese education, and even that of the literati, if you want to put it in that perspective. And how that influenced him, I'm not quite sure myself, but I think it got him very interested in culture, if you like, in his identity, and also his desire, you know, to want to creatively express himself. And I do also will, you know, again hazard a kind of you know, a guess about, or not a guess, an assumption, yeah, a view, if you like, a perspective, that he maybe even experienced a sense of, well, who am I? Because he was born in Sarawak, and then he went to China, and then he, you know, saw all of these new experiences and experienced all of these new things, and was learning and studying in a particular way, and therefore that was something that maybe spurred him on. He did was also influenced when he came back, and he saw, and this is in the book, Japanese artists, and in fact, no, it wasn't a Japanese artist, it was actually a journalist, if I'm not wrong, documenting or painting out of doors on plein air, and there were a lot of Japanese journalists there at the time who were actually, you know, sketch artists and painters doing this, you know, throwaway, you know, like sketches and so on of their environment, and he saw this Japanese painter in the field, you know, and then he was interested. And so I think all of these things, you know, were put together, kind of gave him the desire, if you like, to explore further art practice, because he was largely self-taught, and in doing so, you know, he was inspired to learn about all of these different things, and then also that thing about the Japanese artist. Why is it so interesting, you know, that he's painting a field, you know, and so in that exposure, questions about himself, I feel that that's how it influenced his desire to become an artist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah. You know, when I look at his art at Michael Smith's home and also in the exhibition, what I say in the video, which is what I feel, it is very hard to define his art. He obviously were influenced by, you know, many different artists, both his Chinese root and as well as all the Western art. I think it's very much like the generation, you know, his generation of artists, particularly the Chinese artists like Xu Beihong, Lin Fengmian, who are struggling with Chinese tradition as well as the Western art. And you know, you show a lot of similarities, his inspiration from Van Gogh, from Gauguin, you know, all this Western art. So I'm very curious about you know, this Chinese root, this Chinese artistic tradition that actually had something to help him to develop this kind of artistic language. Yes.
You're asking about Confucianism.
Confucianism, yes. I was going to bring up the Confucianism because this is in your essay. Actually, I quote. In your essay, you said Confucianism extolled values as a reflection of man himself. Image of a man was reckoning in imaging who he was in life, in civilization. So, explain.
So I don't know. I mean, those of you who are ethnically Chinese, this is actually a very controversial subject, but we like controversy. But I'm, you know, a staunch believer in this, you know, in this idea of Confucianism and the moral, if you like, the moral code of Confucianism, and how it informs identity, if you like, of the ethnically Chinese. And I'm very sure that you can see that in Yong Mun Sen's painting. I don't think it's about the philosophy of Confucianism as such, but that it was part so structural to his identity, you know, as a Chinese, an ethnically Chinese person, as a husband, a father, provider, an entrepreneur, you know, and someone who lived through the wars, and then his desire to become an artist regardless. And then in fact, during the war, he went back to farming. So all of this hardship, and yet, you know, these like thousand paintings at least about there, Yeah. And you see this, and materials were scarce. We have to remember this, materials were really scarce. And so why is Confucianism a bit controversial is because around the same time, 1910, 1920s, I think you're familiar with the New Culture movement, and a lot of Chinese artists who were actually anti-Confucianism. But they forget, I think, that it wasn't really about the philosophy or the indoctrination as such, but a form of a more, to me, I can't find any other phrase to describe it except to say, the moral code or the value system. And I feel this is important because in order to really be authentic, if you like, or to be genuine, in your desire to represent yourself, your life, your environment, or even people, you have to have that value. You have to want to know, to want to be genuine, and that's what happened, with people like Van Gogh and Gauguin, and producing the so-called the visceral and the very realistic. They were vilified. They were like, oh, this is not art, but and that's the two extremes of it. So, and again, we come back to this moral situation. I think that we forget that even today with contemporary art, that artists forget. They do, regardless of whether they think, art carries a moral value, it actually does. And whether artists have moral responsibility, they actually do. And if you look at all of the artworks, in particular of Yong Mun Sen and of the land, of the sea, and everything that we're talking about in the book, and what Professor Wei Shi was talking about, this idea of that he really, you know, was trying to carry that moral responsibility, of who he was, to through all of these people, the industry, the fishermen, the farmers, if you like, sorry, what Professor Weishi was talking about, recognizing the gleaners, by Mie, and these people who are laborers, that was what he was trying to not elevate as such, but try to bring the lens to. And it's something that we forget today because we all sit in an office and look at a computer, and yeah, we don't recognize that. And there were people who were like earnest, and the blood and soil, the blood and the toil, of the land. And we're doing that in a way, even with if we want to talk about sustainability and the environment, but just in a very different way. So if we reframe that question, we're no longer farmers, but we still have a relationship, with our environment, and we should better that relationship. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm aware of our time. We can talk this forever, but I wanna ask whether people have some questions or anything that you wanna discuss with Bridget today.
We did so well that nobody wants to ask a question. The education is now complete.
But one thing I do want to. Oh, sorry, there is a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Noit Banai. I'm professor of art history at Hong Kong Baptist University. And what I'm interested in knowing is about the World War II years and whether he made any representations of that period and how he survived it and what it was like to actually deal with ethnicity, his ethnicity and his moral code, as you put it, during those years of World War II and the Japanese occupation, etc. Thank you very much.
I think Michael can answer this question. In terms of paintings, the 40, 41, and then it kind of stops, and then 45, 46. So there is a gap. Yeah. Oh, that's the one with the. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry, Sanisa needs to fill in on the actual dates of those paintings in the wall. I think they're very few. I think they're very few.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. They're very few, but off by recollection, within our collection,
The paddy
the
fields,
paddy
yeah,
fields are
yeah.
44. We have Living in the Forest 40. We do have one piece that's 41. Help supplement. There's a few pieces of 41.
Yeah. So
But very few. But you're absolutely right. They're very few.
I would hazard 42 to 44, maybe 44 is that the very first piece. There were like those 2 years, probably nothing. Um, so during the war, probably very little or nothing. And if you, it's kind of interesting, the 44 one would be the paddy field. It's not here, it's in the book. Sorry, take a look at the book. Sorry. It's, and that's because during the war, he couldn't do anything. He had to go back to farming, really, to eke out, sustenance for his family. And I would say, and that painting is quite small. Yeah, really small. Yeah, of probably what he was looking at daily, and then understanding even more the toil. So I'm not sure I've answered your question. Okay, how did he deal with his moral code during the Japanese occupation? You mean? I don't know if you. I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to that. You wanna? Are you? I mean,
Okay,
do you
yeah,
know
no,
what
so
I-
he was asked to do Japanese propaganda art.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think he ended up doing anti-propaganda art rather than propaganda art. There is literature of that, but he moved away, and I think that is why he hunkered down and he didn't really create.
He-
But I'm
Yeah.
he
He
didn't
went
create
into
that.
hiding, kind of.
Correct,
Yeah.
and I'm going to pass the
You want to add something?
add some more.
Many of the artists were actually the Chinese artists were before the war, because the Sino-Japanese War preceded the Second World War, so there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in any case, and they were very familiar with a mode of communicating through graphic art, and many of the artists found themselves in a big conundrum, and I think a lot of them just went into hiding. So in this case, I don't recall the anti-Japanese material, but do you want to talk a little bit about that? Sorry, Michael. Now I'm going to answer that
So-
question.
We are still looking for those works. But to supplement, it's true he went into hiding, and he had a farmland near Aitam, where he's actually buried now. And from the family accounts, basically a lot of his works, they had to hide it in caves. They had to hide it from the Japanese because there was a lot of destruction of arts and culture. So that's why kind of pre-war, a lot of those works are very, very few. So most of the works that we see is actually post-war. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a big shame because there are a lot of Chinese, probably a lot of Chinese ink painting from before then that I think nobody can find now. Yeah. So with that triage, do we kind of cover the ground a little bit?
One more
Thank
question.
you. Thank
One
you.
more question, yes, please.
Hello, good evening. I would like to ask quickly, after you come across the artworks, what did you surprise more to you, both of you, once that you go through all of it?
One thing struck me, when I look at his painting, I see a lot of similarities between his art and many of his contemporary Chinese artists who are trying to, how to say, find a artistic language to make a change. Before this time, before Yong Mun Sen and his time, a lot of artists were trained in a very traditional Chinese way. They don't do art like this. If you are familiar with Chinese art history, so and being a self-taught artist, I'm very surprised that his artistic skill his understanding of art, and the way he tried to reflect his world, his people, his family. That's really striking. And I think I'm not the only one who see that. Even Xibei Hong, one of the pioneer artists at that time, when he saw Mun Sen's work, he was very surprised. He was completely shocked that there's an artist that is self-taught that can make such a wonderful one. And I think by putting together this show, I think that's definitely what I feel.
It'd be grossly arrogant of me to say nothing surprised me, but I I do think that what I said earlier about that we take for granted visually. This is something I go through every day. So I think the surprises are more seeing it in the flesh and being able to appreciate little details a lot clearer. There is actually one thing that did kind of surprise me, and I think, and this is related to the earlier question as well, and what we're talking about here today, is that actually looking at some of the works, you do get a little bit emotional. So this one I cannot, I might tell you this, but you haven't seen the work, so you wouldn't quite grasp it. But if you were to actually see the works, and it's not that you go there deliberately and you look at it and you try to eke out the emotion, you do just feel it, and it's a very rare thing for me, and that surprised me. I think. I mean, you can get like emotionally attached to a work, or because you understand the artist, or you're acquainted with the artist, or his descendants, his style, or his biography. But in this situation, just objects that pull together, and little sort of allegories, if you like, that kind of resonate, and then you feel a little emotional. So that was a bit of a surprise. We're on a roll.
Another question.
When you talk about surprises and all other discoveries, when you look at the artist, do you see anything similar when you check any contemporary Chinese artists? Do you see any tradition there? Because when you look at their paintings, sometimes you think about some contemporary Chinese artists, maybe in the 80s or 90s. What would be your thoughts about that?
You mean like postcard?
Contemporary Chinese artist, do you see any similarity? 1980s, yeah, 1980s, 1990s. You go first. You are the expert.
We're like busy palming it off. I can only talk about the use the way the medium is used, or the way the artist tries to be very agile, if you like, with the various mediums that he uses to reflect what the experience is. And I think this is something that maybe we can identify with when you were talking about the artists in the 80s and the 90s, the contemporary Chinese artists. You can't really compare it, visually in terms of subject matter. You can only talk very well. Maybe Dr. Zhao can, and he will tell you that later. But I think it's more the practice, that this is what we're interested in. This is how we want to reflect our sentiment. This is what we want to call attention to. And then to experiment and to be so wide, to have a wide range, to have different language, if you like. Well, the language is very similar, or an artistic style, but to employ different mediums in order to adequately convey, if you like, an element of the spirit or the experience. I think this is something that I would say in a very abstract, analogy that compares with the contemporary artists of the 90s, 80s, and 90s. Dr. Zhao?
I think if we put in the historical context, there are a lot of similarities. When Yong Mun Sen started to practice art, he was in the time when a lot of artists were struggling with tradition, and Chinese tradition in particular, and Western art. So you can obviously see, as Bridget talked about, the influence of his art by the modernist of the European masters. In the 1980s, 1990s, similar things happened for the Chinese artists too. After China was closed for a long time, this was when I was in college. So all of a sudden, our generation started to feel was exposed to Western art again, and so there was a sort of a desire or wish to change the Chinese art. So in that way, I think they belong to the same sort of brave artists who want to break what they learn and want to explore something new. And I think particularly Yong Mun Sen, his art, when you look at the catalog and they are themselves embody this kind of artistic sort of creation or exploration. So if we have to compare compare them, I think that's the way to compare. Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if I also one question.
Yes, thank you very much. This is actually a question, actually comment coming from this question, and also completely out of ignorance. But when I saw the exhibit, what really came to mind for me was a lot of the art that I'd seen in the Philippines, particularly artists such as Amor Solo and such. It seemed very similar to me and resonated with me, having come from the Philippines. And so I'm wondering, we've been talking about Yong Mun Sen in the context of his Chinese education, Chinese links, Chinese traditions, but in my mind, when I just look at it without much knowledge, I just think, well, it's very Southeast Asian. I mean, there are many links to Southeast Asian art. So to me, this seems more important in some ways, what he has in common with Southeast Asian artists, particularly in the Philippines, at least for me.
So the question is, okay, actually this is good. I was trying to think in my head whether there's how do I draw a line under this, if I could. When we talk about Nanyang, that's what it is. It's Southeast Asia. People think Nanyang is a Chinese thing. And really, the Chinese words just mean South Ocean, and that's how the Chinese immigrant or the migrants referred to Southeast Asia. And when we talk about Nanyang, we also forget that when the Chinese artists who were trained and became artists really in the mainland before they came out into this region, they were trained in schools that taught both Western and Chinese art. And it was a very modern kind of education. And those schools were actually established by Chinese merchants. So bear with me while I give you this a little bit of historical information. Were actually built by Chinese merchants who came out into this region, made their money, and sent money back to China to say, I'm going to establish these art academies, and I'm going to, make a modern education, in art. And so what am I getting at by talking about that is that these artists were obviously very interested, in the modern idea of how to represent, so-called themselves in the region when they came out here. And then the thing that links back to this question of us being ethnically Chinese, or talking a little bit about, I mean, my mother's family was born, in Bogor in Indonesia. So, but this thing about linking, but still being ethnically Chinese and Confucianism and so on and so forth, was that when the Chinese came out here, they didn't think they were going to stay here. They actually had a mind to, I'm going to come here, do some stuff, and then I'll go back. But the reality was they couldn't. So this is why, if you go to the exhibition, and the video will be posted on the website after the exhibition, if you listen to Professor Wang Gongwu, the interview that we conducted, that fracture, that is almost like a kind of like, it was a cut, a moment in time that was cut off, really impacted the psyche of the artist. And that relationship to so-called representation in Southeast Asia or Southeast Asian artists and questions of identity is that link that I think that you're talking about. Never mind the environment, of course the visual, the landscape is very, very similar, especially if you're going to bring up Amor Solo, the mango trees, the paddy fields and so on. The largesse, if you like, of living in the land, benefiting from the land, and then having just at the back of you, the colonials, and then other imperialists, all of that, were questions I think that the artists were very interested in, and that they struggled, to try to reconcile when they themselves were trained in a colonial paradigm. And how do they? It was a transformative act, if I were to put it in that sense. And that's really, really the story of Nanyang as well. If the Philippines included. Does that? I know it's not a question, but I wanted to try and rationalize that a little bit. Yeah. But does that help?
Okay, we have one more question here. Sorry.
In a way, my question is a variation of what El just asked. And maybe going back even further, before Second World War, when we talk about Nanyang Chinese, obviously during his time, he went back. And his time in China, the influences he had, picking up calligraphy and all the other skills. But unlike even the generation of Professor Wang Gungwu, he actually could travel back and forth. It was not interrupted by the Civil War. He after he went back after 1911 in Republican China, but somehow, unlike many other Nanyang Chinese who were drawn back to China and that sort of identity, the kind of nationalistic ideals, he went back. I don't know whether it was for family reasons or other reasons, but he wasn't quite share the identity of some other Nanyang Chinese. He decided to return to Nanyang. So I sort of, at the back of my mind is in terms of that kind of back and forth, his sort of Chinese background, culture, calligraphy and all that. But at the same time, he was drawn to go back. And then he painted all this work in that environment. And the sort of question I had in mind, the second one related to the question earlier, is to what extent he also had been influenced by other artists who also were, he was self-taught, but he had that sort of Chinese influence. He had Western influence through his Chinese exposure and also all these other things that he read. But obviously the subject matters were very different. And then I'm just wondering whether the sort of the company he kept among artists in the region, whether there are other people he worked with, whether there are other artists who might or might not be as skillful as he was, but somehow, what kind of artistic community was there in Nanyang that would have interacted with him? So that's someone also ignorant about his work and artistry in Southeast Asia.
What sort of artistic community is really, you kind of answered the question. The Chinese artists were there, and they made many. They formed many associations, and the most famous one would be the Society of Chinese Artists, that was responsible in part for the formation of and the founding of the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts. That's one, and then I believe he was a member of Penang Arts. Was he a member, president? Which was the predecessor, or yeah. Other art societies in Penang, in the Straits, basically. We're looking at in the Straits. But they were primarily Chinese artists who were already based here. So I don't think there was a question of that there were Balinese artists or that there were, ethnically Southeast Asian artists at that time specifically anyway. I don't know if that answers your question. Does that answer your question?
He participated in many group exhibitions, both in Malaysia and other places. So I think he's quite active in the artistic circle. at that time. So there are many artists interact with him for sure. Yeah, he's one of the best. Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to say, yeah. I'm going to say that he also associated with what we call, the big four, if you like, that is responsible for this Nanyang concept, which would be Chen Wenxi, Liu Kang, Zhong Subing, and Chen Chongrui. And they were the ones who traveled quite a bit. And it's often that they refer to traveling or going to Bali. They didn't just go to Bali. They went all around Southeast Asia. And they interacted with a lot of the artists and brought back some of these, if you like, the visual language, batik painting, indigenous interpretations, if you like, of the surroundings and the environment. And they were responsible for passing this around, with their peers at the time. So it's all very sketchy now. I don't know if that helps. If that
I see
helps.
one
Yeah.
last question. Sorry.
I would very much like to ask a question going back to a self-taught aspect, as partly because I'm a self-taught artist, not by choice actually, and also I've been studying quite a few self-taught artists regarding their styles. Usually, if many of such artists, their style or their skills could be very influential because of their lack of traditional or institutional art schools influence. So sometimes it could be controversial, but the style could be so long lasting and for the generation it could be so, and also pioneering that people would, that it could be so impactful. Could you comment on some of his styles that can be characteristics of such lack of formal art training? I do have one example because I have an artist friend, a Hong Kong artist friend, who happened to be in Singapore and went to this exhibition. And when she came back, she was like thanking me for telling her to go to this exhibition and saying that she found that the style of his reflection of light on water is so unique that she'd never seen. And when she came back to Hong Kong, she immediately thanking me, and she said, "I'm starting on some new work, trying his style." So would you have any other, of such very characteristic styles you can comment on about
I think Yong Mun Sen represent a very unique, if we call artistic style. To me, as our historian, I think it's very hard to define it. So he's very unique in that way. I wouldn't characterize as any particular existing art historical category. So with Michael and Sanesa's collection, we just started to understand him. I think there will be a lot of study to put him in the right context, and his influence particularly in the Nanyang art. I think that's something in the future. I think right now Bridget is doing that. I think that something exciting.
The water is something I talk to death about. Not just the water, but the light, the air. The two things that we, and this we'll talk primarily about the watercolor. Two things that are very difficult to represent in watercolor or in any medium is stuff that's moving, and that's light, and that air, light, air, and water. So I'm kind of, really humbled to learn that your friend is, has picked that up, because, and we're only able to see this, with the sheer benefit of having seen so many of it, and that they're very, very different. That he had the benefit of being able to experiment. How do I do this? So every representation, if you go to the exhibition, I know you're booking your air tickets tonight. You go to the exhibition, you will see not one really is the same. And everything is changing, and he had the benefit of this lack of training in order to experiment and to decide, I'm going to do it like this, and then I'll see what it looks like, and then I'm going to do it like this, and I'll see what it looks like. And if that has yielded a lexicon, if you like, of water representation that someone now wants to refer to and experiment with, then I think it's done its job. And thank you actually for bringing that up, not me. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up. But before we close, I'd like to thank Bridget, Dr. Tan, flying all the way from Singapore today, actually. So it's a long journey. But thank you for come to share your thought, your idea, and take us the journey to understand Yong Mun Sen, this very important artist to all of us. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Jiao. Thank you.
Okay, don't go yet. Those of you, we're gonna do a group photos because we have a photographer here. So stay in your seat. But I'm gonna quickly wrap up, and I want to thank both of you, Tian Long and Bridget, for your wonderful presentation and your commentary, because I've certainly learned a lot and continue to learn a lot from programs like this. And I think I went to Singapore mainly to see the show, but I also had an opportunity to see the Liu Guosheng show. And for me, what I love about the development here in Asia these days is we have institutions now that can show these really perspective, retrospective, and not just a few painting, but the breadth and the depth of their work. So I'm really excited, and now with the Palace Museum joining that rank, along with M Plus and all of that, it's really exciting to see. So I want to kind of wrap up by kind of quoting another famous Malaysian. She says there are plenty of stories to be told from Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Asia Pacific, and urges filmmakers and artists to go beyond their comfort zones. And that came from none other than Oscar winner Michelle Yeoh this past week when she was in Hong Kong. So I think Michelle, like Yong Mun Sen, reminds me of their globalness of their and the influence, who influenced by both East and West, and achieving great new heights. So I hope with that, artists out there, go beyond our own borders, because it's really important. I think what earlier said, there's just so much conflict these days. I think art, Saniza says it in the video very beautifully. Art does connect. I think right now art is without borders, and we really need connections more than ever. So I want to thank Michael and Saniza for your vision and your foresights in bringing back your grandfather's work. And again, thank all of you for being here with us. And we'll do now the group photo. So where do you want us? How do we do this? No, I think we're going to do it. Yes, everybody's here, so we should do a. And